Janelle and Maria to you so you know who you're going to be hearing from for this first session. And we kind of did this, if you've joined us in person, like Dave mentioned before, you know that our sessions are often just full of multiple voices on an issue where we try to get someone from every side so that you could run back to the newsroom and file a story if you had to. But that is not exactly how our virtual workshops work. We're much more interested in these and getting story ideas on your radar and introducing you to sources we think are just phenomenal speakers and people you should know about and be following up with when you report on these kinds of issues. And we thought it would be really cool to kick this workshop off with a session featuring some of the much younger climate activists that often don't get included in our discussions, people who will make you question what you've done with your life because they've done so much in half the time. At least that's me speaking from experience. And so we're really stoked that Janelle and Maria could join us today. So Janelle Lapointe is an Afro-Indigenous climate justice and Indigenous rights organizer from the Stellatan First Nation. Currently, she works as the youth and community organizer at the David Suzuki Foundation, and that's based in Vancouver, British Columbia. Growing up on her small reserve along the Highway of Tears, Janelle witnessed firsthand how extractive industry practices not only degrades our natural environment, but is deeply connected to cultural genocide and the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. She now advocates for a healthy environment for future generations, ensuring anti-racism and intersectionality is at the forefront of climate conversations. So we'll hear from Janelle first, and then once Maria joins us, we'll hear from her. And Maria is a first-generation Katracha from Newark, New Jersey. She's the Deputy Director of Organizing and Advocacy of Ironbound Community Corporation. She was part of the team that fought for the passage of the landmark Environmental Justice Bill in September of 2020. That bill helps the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection assess public health impacts and environmental risks that renewing or expanding facilities bring into communities. Her work, in addition to environmental justice, is at the intersections of housing, immigration, policy, and economic justice for frontline communities. She's on the board of the Climate Justice Alliance and a co-founder of the Roots Project, and is also a member of the Biden administration's White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And if Jerome pops up, I'll introduce him, but I want to give plenty of time for conversation and to hear from Janelle and Maria. So Janelle, welcome. And we're going to I'm going to stop talking and let you take over.
Sure, thanks, Adam. Yeah, so excited to be in a virtual space with you folks. Storytelling and media, of course, is like a huge part of climate action, and I'm really excited to do a little bit of storytelling with other storytellers. My Etsy always says to know who I am is to know where I come from, so I'll probably start just by framing up a little bit about how I grew up and how I kind of came to doing this work. As Adam mentioned, I'm from Stellatan First Nation, which is basically the geographical center of what we know as British Columbia in Canada. So it's in the northern interior, really small community, about 1,200 people, about a few hours drive from any major city center here in BC. And that's the traditional homelands of my grandmother. So I was very fortunate to get to grow up on the lands that my ancestors have inhabited for time immemorial. And I was a pretty shy, but deeply curious kid. And so my idea of fun was always to be outside in the forest and the rivers and to be around nature. So whenever I talk about climate action, I like to introduce my young self and talk about my young self, because I feel like those years were so formative as to how I see the world now. I remember in third grade when we were doing a show and tell of what our favorite animals are. Usually when you're that age, it's like your favorite animal is like a puppy or a kitty or like maybe like a tiger or a giraffe. And I like remember standing up in front of my class and telling everyone that my favorite animal was the sockeye salmon and telling them all I knew about the life cycle of salmon. So I know environmentalists are often called tree huggers. I always say I was a fish hugger first. So I grew up loving salmon, getting to explore outside a whole bunch, getting to grow up with my grandmother, who is a Dacath elder and fluent in her language, and really instilled in me a lot of cultural practices and understanding of the natural world around me. But of course, with the clear-eyed approach to seeing the world and connecting to nature, I also saw a lot of destructions of my homelands and my short childhood. Where I'm from in BC has since colonization really been a center of extractive industries. It's like a huge boom and bust forest town nearby. We had a molybdenum mine that was a huge economic generator for settler communities. And now we have all sorts of LNG pipeline proposals going through our lands. I'm about 45 minutes east of Wet'suwet'en, which is has been resisting against Coastal GasLink pipeline here in Canada. And so I really got to see how that affected the lands I grew up on. The Endako River is where my grandmother was born. She used to be able to drink straight from the stream. When I was young, it was full of fish, and now it's really silty, undrinkable. Our salmon stocks are collapsing in our territory. There's been dams that have permanently disrupted the flow of our rivers so much that the salmon that were once my favorite animal are unable to spawn. We have white sturgeon, which are an endangered species here in BC. Used to be a plentiful food source for our people, but is now on the brink of extinction just from a dam that was put through our river and really doesn't benefit our community economically at all. As mentioned in my introduction, I grew up around the Highway of Tears, which is infamous for the number of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Police estimate around 15 cases have been on, but communities think the number is about triple that. And of course, often we don't see those cases well resourced or well investigated. And I really see how the economic activity and the constant threat on our cultural ways of being has impacted our traditional governance and culture. In a place like Wet'suwet'en that has their hereditary system intact, I really see how they're able to put on a stronger front and resistance against corporations, whereas a small community like mine that has been so severely impacted by the extraction on our territories, it really has an influence on our ability to use the governance structures that predate colonialism. So I feel like I moved away from my home community, like carrying that like immense grief and like really noticing things, but not having the language or being able to kind of weave a thread on how they were connected. And then of course, like the immense like joy of getting to grow up on the homelands and getting to love and connect nature and be close to the elders in my community that of course practice what was left of my culture. And so when I went to university, I was studying a tourism degree. I wasn't really actively thinking about climate action, though it was something that would impact me. Like I remember getting like very upset over some of the documentaries I would watch about environmental destruction, or like seeing a commercial about the pollutions in the ocean would really like send me with like an immense sense of dread. But I had no idea like where I fit in to the picture or how that was connected to my own lived experience. And so I kind of just went through university trying to live like a normal Western life, get an education, was hoping to get a good job, be a corporate event planner was what I wanted to do. And I was kind of set my sails that way. And And at the time, there was a pipeline going through the territory. I went to university, the Trans Mountain Pipeline. And I knew that some of the Indigenous people were also engaging in some resistance against the pipeline. I'd heard a little bit of conversation about it at school, but again, didn't know where I had fit into that. And I was really homesick one semester and attended this university gala, and it opened with a land acknowledgement from this like tiny, really sweet elder who was actually from close to where I was from. And she reminded me so much of my grandma, like the stature, the way she spoke. And she opened with like the most beautiful prayer, talking about the university's responsibility of being on the unceded lands of the Secwepemc. She was talking about our connection to all creatures, the wind creatures, the sea creatures, the creepy crawlies. And I was like closing my eyes and really like having almost like this transcendent experience of like remembering my childhood, remembering what it felt like to be connected to the land as a child, and feeling like what it felt like to feel that responsibility on lands that were not my own. And when I opened my eyes from this really beautiful opening and prayer, I saw that she was being quickly helped off stage by some men in suits and university executives. And right behind her followed a $50,000 check from then Kinder Morgan, now Trans Mountain Pipeline. And everyone like stood up in applause because it was a big donation to the university. And I just remember being like full body struck of like what I had witnessed, which was like literally like an elder being moved off stage to make way for this like corporate check that was being celebrated. And that for me like clicked, because I was like, wow, it's so symbolic of the way Indigenous people in Canada are removed in order to make way for extraction. So I tell that whole story because my orientation to climate action and climate justice has always been to draw the threads and to tell the full story of Canada as it exists, and how from its inception has really been about removing Indigenous people, exploiting land, exploiting labor of marginalized communities in order to make way for corporations to be able to extract and maximize their profit. You know, starting with its inception in 1867, the colonial power gave their successor exclusive control over the lands and peoples, as if Indigenous people had never existed on these lands. And then, you know, soon after that, the Indian Act was put in place, which was a piece of legislation that was designed to control and dominate Indigenous peoples and to dispossess them from their lands and assimilate their cultures. Post-World War II, we also saw how Asian and Black populations were systematically excluded from Canada. Their population was kept below 1% and basically strictly used for labor to complete railway projects. Indigenous people were subject to Jim Crow laws and practices that were affecting Canada even until the 1960s. And then, of course, we had the residential school system that was taking children from their homes and communities and placing them in a Catholic school structure that was designed to violently assimilate them into Western Canadian culture. And this story is one that I think is still hid from everyday Canadian people. Of course, a couple of years ago, for those of you in Canada, know that there was an uncovering of mass graves in Canada of children that attended residential schools. And this kind of sparked a national conversation. But what I often don't see is like weaving the story of Indigenous struggle to you know, kind of the crises we're facing today, whether that's a climate crisis or an economic crisis. Indigenous communities are the poorest in our country, which I'm always like, how can that be when we come from lands that are so resource rich, and the land is the basis of the economy in this country? And of course, the removal took us away from our food source, medicines, and spiritual life. But Indigenous people are still on the front lines. They're yeah, so basically, yeah, I feel like in 2019, with the massive success of the youth climate strikes, we really saw climate change being talked about and forefronted in the media, but it was often told in the story, of course, of looking out for what's to come and looking for our future generations, which of course is compatible with Indigenous worldviews. But what wasn't often talked about was how the foundations of Canada and the plight of Indigenous people has made way for this mass resource extraction that is contributing to the climate crisis, and how climate action in this country will not happen as long as Indigenous people are not able to enact their governance structures, or to be able to share their cultural knowledge of being able to live sustainably on these lands for hundreds of years. And how, yeah, everything, it was very by design. So yeah, right from 1867, when they were given rights to these lands for resource extraction, to modern day corporations acting on these lands. So with Coastal GasLink going through Wet'suwet'en land, Canada giving the Royal Mounted Police lethal overwatch over Indigenous peoples and using lethal force to stop them from blocking the pipeline. Racism and white supremacy, and of course exploitation of Indigenous people is at the core of this economic system. And so to make systems that are compatible with climate action, that needs to be addressed. And I feel like often Canadian audiences respond to stories about how anti-racism fits into environmentalism, with thinking that racism isn't a Canadian problem. We're often comparing ourselves to the United States, or ignoring the ways that our structures are systemically excluding marginalized communities. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there, because I also see Maria has joined, but yeah, basically just wanted to highlight how I have basically come to climate action through a lived experience of seeing destruction on my lands, but also seeing the way my culture can use and really honor the land sustainably. And so whenever I talk about climate action, I'm really trying to ensure that there's a place to talk about the dispossession of Indigenous people, and how racism and white supremacy has a play in that. And then, of course, to really be clear in naming the villains. So, of course, the governance system operates in a way that enacts the system, but to also kind of pull the curtain on the way that corporations have lobbied our government and blocked climate action, and are often the ones that are profiting the most from the resources taken from Indigenous land and from the labor of marginalized people. So yeah, I'll stop there, and looking forward to the conversation and questions to come.
Thanks so much, Janelle. All right, Maria, you are here. I think we may just get your voice, or we may see if we can see your face as well.
Yes, I'm trying to put video. Let me try, but it gets choppy on my end. So I might have to.
Looks good.
Okay. Yeah, it just starts freezing a little bit. So you tell me if I get cut off. I'll turn the video off.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. I'm Maria Lopez Nunez. I'm with Ironbound Community Corporation in Newark, New Jersey. I'm also on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. It's weird to connect the two. Just thinking of what Ironbound is. For those of you that don't know what Ironbound is, which I wouldn't expect you to, it's a small neighborhood in the city of Newark in New Jersey, right? So folks that have gone to New York City, you probably flew right past us, you know, or maybe you landed in Newark, but they told you it was a New York airport. It's actually not a New York airport. It's very much in a different state than New York City, but it serves the interest of New York City, right? Because in every place in the US and across the globe, there are places called sacrifice zones, right? They're an area where for us to live the life that we have, that we've come to enjoy, especially in the US and in developed countries, where we like to just order things and they show up at our doorsteps in a few days, right? We like the convenience. We like to flip on switches and know that the light will come on, or we flush the toilet. We don't think about those things, right? You don't think about what happens when you throw something out. But I'll tell you, there are neighborhoods that live with the consequences of our industrialized lifestyles, right? And those places I call sacrifice zones. So I'll back up here a little bit and tell you about my neighborhood. We're a 4 square mile neighborhood, right? Just 4 square miles. So everything I will tell you is in our neighborhood boundaries, but we have 3 power plants. We have the country's longest Superfund site, which is the Passaic River. That's when during the Vietnam War, we were dumping Agent Orange. We were creating Agent Orange and then dumping that dioxin right into the river, right? Dioxin is a byproduct of Agent Orange that Agent Orange, by the way, because I realize now that people might not know what it is. You know, it's a defoliant. They used it during the Vietnam War to spray it on plants so that the leaves would fall off immediately in the jungles, right, in Vietnam. What's unfortunate, of course, is people are still being born with birth defects from Agent Orange. And here in the US, we still live with the legacy of trying to poison other people and poisoning ourselves, right? You can't poison others without poisoning yourself. So obviously in this country, though, we poison people along racial and class lines, right? Like environmental justice for me is rooted completely in a race and class analysis, in a systemic cause analysis. We don't just look at symptoms. We're not just trying to plant trees here. We're trying to actually think about what are the things, the systemic reasonings that lead to neighborhoods like mine. Like I said, we have the longest Superfund site in the country. We have the state's largest garbage incinerator, the state's largest sewage waste treatment facility, and they will also host the port of Newark and Elizabeth, which is the largest port on the East Coast. And that means that 80% of the consumer goods that come in for the tri-state area, right? This heartbeat of capitalism that is New York, everything from Fifth Avenue to the dollar store, it's coming into the ports and then getting loaded up on a truck. Those trucks bypass our neighborhood, right? Because we are surrounded by 109, 21, 280, and the turnpike that cross up our neighborhood. That's what we're called iron-bound, right? It is from a long history of being an industrial wasteland. And so people live here. People live here that once served industry, but now we become disposable. And that industry has moved on. It just hires, highly skilled engineers, not the folks that live in our neighborhood. All we get to contend with is the health burdens that come from the cumulative impacts, right? I always say like a third grader could look outside the window and say, this doesn't work. You can't keep concentrating pollution on one group of people. And if you do continue to do so, that means that as a society, you've said those people are disposable. It doesn't matter that they're being exposed to arsenic, lead, mercury, dioxin, you name it. It's probably coming into our lungs. In our neighborhood, we really think about what is that smell, right? Like we play that game. Like, what's that smell? Is it coming from the fat rendering plant where they broil carcasses till the fat separates from the bone so that people can have makeup and oil, lotions, right? Put their soaps on, their flowery soaps. Well, we get to live with that processing facilities that have rack up hundreds of violations and nothing gets done about it. We get to live with the garbage incinerator that sometimes burns purple. And we think, is that a bad gender reveal? No, they want to say, oh, it's just an iodine bottle, but they're actually burning unregulated medical waste, right? So there's so many industries that as a community, we have to fight. And we do. We fight them. Even this past week, we had a permit hearing for 2 Title V. Title V is the highest level of pollution permit that you can get in the US. Last week, we had the Newark Energy Center, one of the 3 power plants. We're fighting a 4th power plant because our sewage treatment facility says, oh, climate change. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna build myself a power plant. So I can contribute to climate change, but if the sea level rises, I will have my own backup power, right? Like everyone is out for themselves and not thinking again about our community. We're also going to be last night we were dealing with the permit for Covanta, the garbage incinerator, and tonight we're going to be fighting against the sludge plant. That's saying sludge is actually called biochar. They just changed the vocabulary to skirt regulation, right? Like that is what industry is doing. It's very simple. It's not that hard to read. You know, I like to say I'm not really educated in all this, but I've had such an education in this work. And so we have to fight all these things hand-to-hand combat, but that doesn't stop organizations like mine from thinking about the bigger picture. I'm really proud to say that 2 years ago, we passed the strongest environmental justice law in the country, the Cumulative Impacts Law, S232, which dictated that first off, what is well, in the law, we call it urban burden, but I know it as environmental justice communities, which is communities that are either 35% low income or 40% people of color or 40% linguistic isolation. And if your community hits one of those thresholds, that means extra review is triggered, right? It doesn't mean that things are automatically denied. It just means we're going to look closer into your application. And when they look closer into the application, an applicant has to demonstrate that they're not going to add to the cumulative burden, because up until now, the law saw every industry as an individual, right? As one individual that could pollute as close to the limits as possible, right? And that's the American way. Everyone's by themselves, right? Individual, you get judged by yourself. But really what happens is it creates a toxic soup. And there is no way for the regulators to actually consider what is the toxic soup in a given neighborhood, given the concentration of industries that are already existing. This allows the regulators in the state of New Jersey to actually take that into consideration and to deny permits that are going to add to that, you know, tip it over by increasing the disproportionate burden that might exist in the neighborhood. So that was an exciting thing. And it's sad for me to say that that's the first of its kind in the country. And so far, no one's caught up. I want other states to catch up and pass it, because I do think that this is really baseline regulation to consider the context of our neighborhood. Adam, I'm gonna need your help because I'm not really sure how much time I'm supposed to take. You know, I'm trying to give people a lot, but I also don't want to go over.
Well, you're doing great. And I think what you've been talking about kind of then leads to the bigger, broader, national scale. You're kind of getting there already, saying you wish more states would adopt this kind of legislation. But if you could give just some thoughts on, federal efforts to address climate change or include communities that have historically been overlooked.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, federal efforts need to look at what's happening on the state level. And that's what I will say, like, good policy is bottom up, right? Like, first you have to convince neighborhoods, municipalities, and states it's a good idea, and then it becomes good federal policy. It doesn't really work the other way around. So that's why we have been engaging in efforts with other states to try to get them to pass good cumulative impacts. Because when we're talking about climate change, it's not going to affect everyone the same way. You know, given the toxic soup I just loaded out, when we flood, it's toxic water that comes into our neighborhood and toxic water that stays behind and really affects our populations. So on the federal level, I think there's a lot of opportunity. There's a good narrative around Justice 40 because we do need more investment, especially in the hardest hit communities, but we need accountability. And that's what we should all be asking from our government. Where are the accountability measures to any climate related program? Right now, what we see is a lot of rhetoric, but I like to say, where are the numbers? Show me the money, right? We need to see where the money is going and to make sure that the money, especially coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure package, because money's still being spent there, are not just going to reward fossil fuel companies for maybe cleaning up their act a little bit. You know, we really need to be investing in the future instead of subsidizing the past, maybe catch up, because the past is never going to catch up. It needs to die, right? We need to let the old ways of fossil fuel profiteering just die off, and we need to give birth to a new economy, I think, in the US. But that's only going to happen if we put environmental justice communities front and center. And if we actually listen to their policy recommendations, because I think I spend so much time talking about my community and the impact we've had, because it does feel as disproportionately polluted as we are, we have an outsized impact on policy, right? Because we actually know what it looks like when it rolls out on the ground. Sometimes we look at think tanks as experts, but they don't have any idea what it looks like when the mechanics of the program actually get animated. And so communities, I think, will be leading. And I do think we need to track how federal agencies are or are not engaging in community-led solutions, and how or how not they're investing in community-led solutions, because that's how we're going to know, are we on the right track or are we really far behind, off the mark? So I think I'll leave it there because I know Jerome could talk more on the federal level.
Yeah, and so you missed my earlier introduction that Jerome, I believe this is related to the fact that he founded and runs an organization aimed at getting out the vote, but he went radio silent on me during the midterms, and I haven't heard from him since. So I have a feeling he's in high demand. He may or may not join, but now that Janelle and Marie have both introduced themselves, that just gets us quicker to Q&A with the reporters, which is great. So folks, in the chat bar, just let me know, say I have a question or whatever, and I will call on you as the questions roll in, and we can just have a conversation right now and see what folks want to know. So don't be shy. This is a room full of journalists. I'm sure somebody has something they want to ask. And Spurti is first out of the gate. So go for it. And please turn your cameras back on, journalists, so that we can see that it's a room full of humans.
Hello, can you hear me, Adam?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I have a question for Janelle. She mentioned about Janelle. You mentioned about the legacy of industries in BC, and what the challenges that are faced by Indigenous people out there. Can you just describe exactly what's happening in the community that you live? You mentioned about industries. I was just curious what kind of industries are right now at the forefront where you have to tackle the changing environment. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, a lot of the impacts we're dealing with are from industrial activity that happened in the 50s and 60s. So in Canada, this was a time when Indigenous people didn't have any say or jurisdiction over their lands. At the time, the government appointed an Indian agent on behalf of the Indian Act, which was the only person. It would be a non-Indigenous person who would be liaison with corporations and government. So the generation before me, of course, saw a lot of industrial activity come in without any say. So it was a lot of overlogging. There was a smelt dam put in on the river by Rio Tinto, which is currently in court with my community. So it's an aluminum smelt dam that powers an aluminum smelt mine that is nowhere even close to my community, and we see no economic benefits from it and all of the impacts of our disruption of the flow. But right now, and what's to come, right now we're dealing with the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which is a major LNG project that is going through territories, and like I said, has been largely fought by our neighbors, the Wet'suwet'en and the Gitxsan people. The unique thing about a lot of the nations in British Columbia is they do not have any treaties with the government and are unceded territories, which by our laws as Indigenous people, but also the Canadian law and of course the international standard of UNDRIP that Canada says that they apply to, should mean that our hereditary chiefs get ultimate say over what happens in the territory. But our hereditary chiefs in Wet'suwet'en have been harassed and arrested and displaced in order to make room for this Coastal GasLink pipeline. And what's really dangerous is that some of our most pristine waterways are on those territories. So I mentioned that the salmon stocks in my own community have collapsed. I'm no longer able to food fish for salmon in my community. So my family has actually been relying on the Morris River, the Wet'suwet'en, for salmon for the last decade. And that's exactly where Coastal GasLink is drilling under as we speak, despite all 5 species of salmon spawning in that river. And salmon, like I said, I'm a nerd about salmon for a lot of reasons, but it's a keystone species, and it feeds the forest, it feeds all the way up the food chain. And in a country like Canada, and especially on the west coast of BC, that is known for its pristine nature and really makes a lot of tourism dollars trying to sell the natural habitats, to sell fishing, to sell hunting. All of that is at risk when we have industries threatening our salmon. And then of course would have like a whole smelt of health and economic impacts. But yeah, right now I would say that the biggest threat is Coastal GasLink pipeline. And right now there's about 5 other LNG pipeline proposals sitting on the table. And I really think there's well, actually, I know there's a plan to try to position that northern interior section of BC that I'm from as an LNG mega site that will have all sorts of big flashy promises about giving economic prosperity to communities and giving energy that we don't actually need more of right now in BC. And often the economic promises to communities are really hard to access. Jobs are temporary and of course high risk and high labor. And then the man camps that are set up in our community, like I mentioned, also really pose a threat to Indigenous women and girls. We often see that when projects come in and man camps set up, there is an increased violence against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. Yeah, mostly LNG is a big one right now.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Janelle. Caroline had a question.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question that stemmed from when Maria was speaking, but maybe if Janelle, if you have thoughts as well, I'd be happy to hear both. The question was, in covering climate justice and environmental justice, I think a lot of the type of stories that we cover are sacrifice zone type of stories, like really bad things happening in communities that are often low income, communities of color, high concentrations of immigrants. And I guess it seems to me that we as journalists who are coming in from outside those communities run a risk of really highlighting all the negative things that are going on. And I'm curious for your thoughts about how we can also highlight the positive things about the community as well, and not sort of just cast communities as just exclusively suffering.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and I struggle with it, right? Because obviously we want our story told, but I think it's all about in the framing. We're not victims. We are being abused by the system, but we are not victims. We're very much active participants in fighting for change, right? For fighting for systemic transformation. And I think that that's where I find the beauty in our community, right? Is like our organization has been around for 53 years. So I always think like I stand on the shoulders of giants, right? Like I get to look at my community elders who've been fighting, one of them that I talk to all the time is 47 years in the same fight for her community that's very much stepped up. It's not just, we used to say it was whack-a-mole between like fighting one side at a time, and then we got smarter about actually changing the rules. So I think there needs to be more attention to how communities actually transform the system and the active role that they play, and not always just like, oh, look, we're suffering. Look at my kid with asthma. I hate when reporters do that. Oh, show me people with asthma. Like that makes me feel kind of sick. I have asthma and I don't always talk about it with reporters or in public forums because I don't, want to put the attention on the individual story. This is very much about what we do to the collective and how communities collectivize in order to not just fight back, but transform the system. And the transformations we want would impact everyone. It wouldn't just be for sacrifice zone. It would make life on earth better, right? If we just change our inherent relationship to capitalism, consumption, and the exploitation of our natural resources. So that's, I think, what's really important to highlight. And sometimes you got to dig deeper and not just go for the easy, show me the people that are suffering angle. So I appreciate that question.
Thank you. I appreciate the answer.
Janelle, did you have thoughts?
Yeah. Maybe I'll just take this opportunity to highlight that one of the differences I see to coverage between the US and Canada is Canadians don't often use the same language or terminology to talk about environmental racism, simply because we don't have the same concentration of people. So of course, there's less quantity of these neighborhoods that are similar to the United States as sacrifice zones, but it does exist in predominantly Black and Indigenous communities in Canada. It's the exact same problem. So I would urge, Canadian journalists to look at stories that happen in Canada. There's Something in the Water, the book and the documentary did a good job of highlighting those Black and Indigenous communities in Nova Scotia that it does happen, to not just frame up environmental racism as an American issue, but something real that happens in Canada. And then, just to really highlight what Maria says, there's so many beautiful stories of our movement elders and leaders in these communities, and also just a huge amount of joy and culture and celebration in the face of just injustices that need to be highlighted, and also really, really intricate and resilient examples of mutual aid that I think right now can really be highlighted, because the reality is we're all kind of in crisis in one way or the other, and that the tools and cultural learnings from these communities should be highlighted as a way, like Maria said, to make all lives better, human and non-human life on Earth. And the name of the documentary is There's Something in the Water.
All right, thanks, Janelle. Mara, you had a question.
Yeah, first of all, just thank you two so much for being here and sharing with us today. I feel like I've already learned so much from you. I had a similar question to Caroline, but I'm just like reflecting, Janelle, on what you said about people missing this connection between climate and justice, and then Maria, what you said about, we're seeing a lot of rhetoric, but maybe not as much accountability. So I'm wondering, like, what kinds of questions do you wish more reporters were asking, both when they're speaking with your communities or when they're speaking with elected officials or company representatives? Like, what are the questions you feel like aren't being asked?
Yeah, I think, pointing to talking about the rhetoric, I think the role of progressive governments in both countries has really been to say nice things and do nice things and contribute to the exact same environmental destruction and climate emissions. So I use a term, the new climate denialism, which is framed from a Canadian policy expert, Seth Klein's book called The Good War. And basically, new climate denialism means that we're not as much, especially in Canada, worried about elected officials being like flat out, climate change doesn't exist. They have now switched to saying climate change exists, we're doing everything we can to fight it, but their actions are doing the exact opposite. So here in Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is often hailed as being a climate champion or being a progressive leader, but he bought Trans Mountain Pipeline for billions of dollars, is continuing to push these projects through Indigenous territories and approve extraction projects of all kinds that are making our climate targets unachievable. And then, of course, compounding the impacts on Canadians, especially marginalized communities. So I don't know if I have exactly specific questions to ask, but for journalists to really be aware of that strategy they use and use their discernment to really ask hard-hitting questions about how their words are matching their actions, and to not be afraid to pull up examples of the ways they're countering climate action and continue to hold their feet to the fire on that.
Yeah, I would echo a lot of that, right? Because obviously we see once it almost, I love what you're saying, Janelle, about like the new climate denialism, because it is absolutely true. And I see it so much in the US. Oh, the Democrats were in charge, great. But like nothing happened. And right into the end, near midterms, right? Like we had a president that actually ran and talked about environmental justice. That was exciting for me, It was exciting to see the initial first steps, and then it just halted to a stop because the attention wasn't there. And sometimes I think I saw it, I felt it, especially during the side deal commotion of journalists just stopping at the easiest answer, right? When they were like, well, we need the side deal, which the side deal was about permitting reform that Manchin was trying to exchange for his vote, right? For the Inflation Reduction Act. And what was unfortunate about that is it was a rubber stamp for fossil fuels. a few people were using the talking point, oh, well, we need that for renewables. Okay, if you needed it for renewables, it would explicitly call out renewables, right? It wouldn't have been such a rubber stamping process that would have let, first off, closed the opportunity for communities to like have a say. But then it would have been more explicitly just about renewables, right? But it obviously was a farce to allow gas and oil a big giveaway, right? I don't think we need to keep pacifying oil and gas in the US. And I do think that both parties do, but we don't hold both parties accountable in the same ways in the media. And that does disturb me because I do think that there's a deep injustice that happens to communities who, honestly, I feel like our communities are just used as bargaining chips. We're expected to show up for elections, but then afterwards, when nothing happens that demonstrates change in our communities, like we're supposed to just take that and still show up at the next elections. Because I do see oftentimes journalists portray us as simple-minded, right? Like we're just not being, we don't understand the nuance. We're not complex enough to understand why we need large-scale permitting reform. So that's where I would just want more analysis into like the nuance of things. And I'm seeing this a lot with the carbon capture and sequestration is becoming very popular in terms of being climate policy, when it's obviously not climate policy. I mean, have we not learned nothing from what happened with recycling in the 80s, right? Like they knew recycling wasn't going to work. They sold it to the world, not just to America, but to the world. And now we have a microplastics problem. And I'm seeing the same thing with carbon capture, and untested technology that the administration is already pouring billions on, that they're at COP acting like it's a trade show for untested technologies that are going to save us. Technology is not going to save us. The only thing that's going to save us from this hole is to stop digging, right? We need to stop the proliferation of fossil fuels. So I do think that as journalists, you do have to do a little bit more work. I don't think it's all of you, but I am seeing that people just stop at the easiest answer and the talking points given to them by those in charge.
All right, thanks, Maria. Ashley, you had a question?
Yes. Also, I just want to say thank you, Janelle and Maria. It's been really enlightening to hear from you. And I think this kind of plays into not stopping at the talking points. So I'm based in Seattle. And so, Janelle, I'm interested to kind of hear your thoughts on some of the salmon restoration efforts going on in just the Northwest, because I know in Seattle, at least, a lot of action plans are performative at best. And so I was curious to know what you have seen that is a meaningful restoration effort, especially when government is working with Indigenous peoples, First Nations, and tribes on those efforts.
Sorry, Ashley, do you mind repeating the question? I think I cut out a little bit there.
Yeah, I was curious if there's any restoration efforts that you've seen that have been really meaningful for salmon restoration as far as their habitat, or if there's something that you would like to see as far as how government is working with Indigenous peoples on those restorations.
Yeah, I can't think of any really good specific answers, which is frightening because it's really pressing and important. But yeah, I think the key is absolutely they need to be working with Indigenous people forefront, like not as partners, but as leaders and as the governors of their own territories. Often, yeah, government is trying to liaise with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, which is really responsibility for the economy of fisheries and not the sustainability or conservation of fisheries. So they're trying to balance this really urgent need of protecting our wild salmon with economic interests and also the interests of sport fishermen and commercial fishermen, and that doesn't work right now. We've done too much damage to be playing the balancing act, and in a lot of cases we need the call for people to just be out of the streams and for Indigenous communities to have the funds and resources to be doing habitat restoration, whether that's replanting native species or just really monitoring and keeping people off the river. In my community, we used to have a really great community-led fisheries program that employed Indigenous youth and had them doing all the environmental monitoring on that land. And that was like axed, like taken away from government resources and then replaced with DFO, which again, like I said, the ministry is often responsible for the economy of resources and not the conservation of resources. So yeah, it's all about it being Indigenous led and not just partnered.
Thank you.
All right, Amira is up next with the question.
Yeah, so I have a question. Maybe Maria can start from your comment about accountability and following the money to find the story. I wanted to ask you in general, like what are like a specific maybe data we need to look at when telling where to start. I'm specifically thinking about Kentucky and the Eastern Kentucky area where there is a lot of new regulation, tax cuts that helped increase the Bitcoin, mining places, and then there is like recently a new solar farm that it's about to be built, which is it's the money story, but at the same time they justify all these new investment or bringing these new investors as it is going to be bringing jobs. But the problem is that these are these new projects don't really bring that many jobs to the area. And at the same time, it actually deprives the community from that public land that it's used as parks. So it's really the same story that it's repeating itself, of taken away from the community and exploiting the people under the excuses that it is going to bring jobs, when we know that these two projects don't really bring that many jobs to the community.
Yeah, no, for sure. Absolutely. And I know in Kentucky, I have some colleagues there that have been struggling, right? Because even under Justice 40, a lot of the money would be theoretically could be used under the big guidance by coal companies in order to like clean up their act. But it's just, it does feel complicated, right? That like, okay, someone messed up, comes in, trashes your house. Oh, I'll pay you to fix it. I'll pay you to fix it. I think is the equation where it's almost like for me, a double negative. Like first off, there was harm done to the public, and now there's additional harm by redirecting money into the people that or the industries that have done the harm in an effort to believe that they'll fix it. Like, I don't know, to me, it's like the market feels irrational in that sense. In terms of following the money, I would say like how much of the money has the requirements of a lot of government funding makes it so that it would only be large corporations that could be eligible for it. It couldn't be really captured by smaller community groups. It's not necessarily even for municipalities. Like I think we don't want to replace big oil and gas with like big renewable that's actually just oil and gas. Like even like I said, with the power plant that we're fighting, they're gonna throw some solar panels on top. And I feel like solar panels are the new window dressing. It's okay to build whatever you want as long as you put a solar panel on top, then we're okay. Like it's sort of renewable. It's as renewable as we can get. And so I think that that's like the new the things that we need to just really look into the details. And it's kind of boring work, but like, look at the budget lines, look at the requirements for those budget lines, look at the dates, the expiration dates of money. One of the big criticisms of the IRA was a lot of the supposed EJ money has expiration dates. If it's not spent in 5 years, it will, be evaporated. Meanwhile, the subsidies, they're guaranteed for the next 10 to 20 years, so like those are big differences. Also, obviously, there's things that are considered environmental justice by the administration that we don't, like nuclear. We don't want more nuclear proliferation. Some of the carbon capture things, and I know in Kentucky, you do need to really look out for carbon capture, right? those experiments are actually being considered environmental justice because it's about supposedly mitigating harm in our communities. So we need to look at the details and not just like what buckets that people are putting things in. Because even when they're in the supposed community budget line or environmental justice, you still have to look at the details. And I know that that's sometimes tedious work, but I think it's worthwhile and it makes for a richer story. I hope that got to it. And with the Bitcoin, yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother rabbit hole to go down that's affecting so many communities across the world.
All right, thanks, Maria. Hera has a question next.
Hi, yeah, I have a question for both of you. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your experiences and for elaborating on things that we can do better as journalists. A question that I have is in regards to where I live and where I report. I think Maine probably has somewhat similar dynamics at play as British Columbia. And I mean, it's the whitest state in the country. And then we have these pockets of unorganized territories where tribal nations live. And so an important thing for me has been, working towards reaching out to those communities and trying to develop relationships with them. And also being cognizant of the fact that I may not, I don't know all the nuances of these communities, but being a person of color, I hope I can, offer that. And try to be more understanding of how to report better on that. So my question to both of you really is, how can I work on developing these relationships and being able to learn from the sustainability methods that tribal nations use, and also just report better and include those voices in my reporting? I think more often than not, I've noticed that with my paper and other newspapers in the state, tribal nations are very hesitant and don't want to speak to reporters. I've been lucky that some have responded to me, but I just want to do better and be able to develop those relationships. So if both of you could answer that.
Sure. Yeah, I can start. Yeah, to develop relationships with Indigenous people is sometimes a slow process, but it's not a hard process. I think learning about whose traditional lands you're on is a starting point. Learning about the different nations, how to pronounce it properly, even practicing using the traditional words for place names you're reporting on. But I think first and foremost is just taking your professional hat on and just being part of the community, keeping an eye out for community events that are being hosted and just attending, being proactive about your relationship instead of waiting for when there's something to report on. I think would do everyone really well. And Indigenous communities are often very open and welcoming to having people participate in some of the celebrations they have, and yeah, to not worry about making mistakes. There's lots of resources on how to engage with communities respectfully, but just know that if you do make mistakes, you will often be corrected, and even if you don't make a mistake, you'll probably be teased lovingly, because that's often the way a lot of racialized communities welcome people in. But yeah, I would say just to be really proactive about your communities. But of course, that's not always possible. So just being mindful of trauma-informed reporting and being culturally aware when reaching out, and paying people, especially people that often don't get paid. I think our elders are often the ones, of course, being knowledge carriers and doing some of the most important work, but they're usually the last people to be paid. So thinking of how you can resource them for their time and expertise is important.
Thank you.
Okay.
And also, Marie, if you could answer that question, just engaging with your community, how do you think reporters can do that better?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest. I've just learned like that it is important, like to engage with reporters. But I know for me, I've part of my own reluctance from feeling misrepresented. And I wouldn't assume that the people you're talking to know the rules. Like I just learned them recently, right? Like when I'm supposed to say off the record, on the record, like all that stuff. Like who the hell knows that? I actually think reporters should have to like disclose before they start talking to you. So I've definitely had earlier on in my work like bad bad moments with that, right? And have learned a lot. But like I don't think that should be the expectation. Like you need to be more graceful if you're going to be talking to community. Because once you make that mistake, even if you didn't make it with me, if it happened in my community, I'll remember. We will remember, right? Like we will remember that reporter will be, that whole publication will be remembered for having done that to a community member. So I think that that's really important and just like a big red flag. And then ask more questions, because I feel like sometimes it's just like so simple, and like that is sometimes frustrating. It's like, just how do you feel about that? And it's like I said, that like victim framing sort of thing. You just want the reaction and not like not there's like an assumption that there's not like a policy take underneath, and it might not be. In I don't always speak in policy words, even though the more I'm in this world, the more it's seeping into my vocabulary. But there is underlying things that community members are saying that do translate actually into tangible policies and accountability. So I think that that's important. And I do realize I didn't really fully answer the previous person's question about the economics, right? And what happens with jobs. Like, I think that's a big deal. Most of the agencies that give subsidies, they give it on a promise. No one ever follows up afterwards, right? And so I think being able to track down people's track record who are receiving these large awards, that they even complete it. We see that time and time again, millions and millions of dollars being given in exchange for how many jobs? Let's just do the math. How much money did these jobs cost the American public, or, the Canadian public, whatever it is, like the budget implications. And then did it actually happen afterwards? When you look 2, 5, 10 years down the line, is it being sustained or not? Because I think that that's the key thing. Economics should not be a trade-off for pollution. Only communities of color and low-income folks are asked to make the choices between economic development and pollution. White communities are not subject to that. So sorry if I didn't answer before.
All right. Thank you both. And I posted in the chat a link to our reporting in Indigenous communities webinar that we put on a while back. There's a lot of good info in there too, because this is there's no simple answer. And the nature of reporting is often very extractive and super time sensitive. You parachute in and you leave. So it's awesome to have a room full of reporters asking that question and thinking about how to do it better. Next up, we have Christine with the question.
Hi, thank you both for all of your insights. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about community, and I'd love to hear from both of you about within your community, are there divisions on these issues, and how do you get people to bring people together around these climate change related issues and pollution and environmental justice issues, and really make it important to them. And I'd love to hear more insights on that. And also in terms of the discussion we've been having about reporters, it's true reporters aren't always the most gracious in the way that we, especially people on deadline, and all people are different, but I do think there are rules. I mean, I learned rules about, like you can assume a politician knows what off the record is, but when you talk to a community member, you have to treat them, somebody who's never been interviewed before, you have to treat them with much more care and make sure they understand that they're speaking to publication. So we do have rules, but maybe not all reporters are respecting them. So and I think it makes sense to hold those reporters or publications responsible. But on the other side, like we need human stories. Like I've done a lot of reporting on climate, and the podcast about heat islands that we led this summer in Washington, D.C., we talked to a lot of community members, and it was really important, not only because to make our stories good, but to make this issue like heat islands. A lot of the vulnerable people we spoke to weren't even, they had so many other things going on in their lives that heat didn't even register on, you know, like in order to make the point that people, you can die from heat. This is a serious issue. If you have other health issues that a lot of people in low income communities have, you're even more vulnerable. So how can we both, you know, and especially, yeah, it's true, a reporter on deadline maybe isn't all that polite about it, but so Maria, to your comment, I understand what you're saying, but the human stories I think are really important, and not only for the journalists, but for the world, for the people to see that this climate change is happening to us people, and we have, you know, it's not a matter of hugging a tree or loving the economy. These are things that are having real impacts. So I know it's a thorny issue, but I'd love to get both of your opinions on this.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, look, is that me? I think this.
It may be, but we can
Okay.
hear you.
You can hear me? Okay, I'm getting massive feedback. Look, I kind of got into a documentary that I did not want to be about me, but the producer, director, whatever, was like dead set on like human interests, human drives, like if people care. And I don't know, like I hear you, like I know that people maybe click on it, but do people care? Like I guess I want to just challenge back. Like, do people actually care? Because I think we've seen plenty of pictures of dying people of color, of genocide, of harm, and it's not really changed anything. Like what's changed things, obviously we saw it after the police killings a few years ago, right? When people were in the streets, like that actually changed something. Like the force of people speaking out for themselves, of saying, I won't take this anymore. You know, like, so I do think that like, yes, the human interest stories are important, but I'm just saying, don't always rely on them. Like there is more. And if human interest stories worked, then I would lean on it, because at the end of the day, I tell my team all the time, it's not about us and how I feel about something. It's about winning for my community. So if it did deliver results, yes, I would do it. I would put out everybody who's been impacted. And we do sometimes, right? Like, but I also want to contest the idea that it always works. You know, people of color being harmed isn't always compelling for the general public. You know, like white folks still sometimes are like, oh, it's okay, you know, because I think about the stats, I think about the harm that's being done. And we've had the human interest stories for decades. And I don't know how much has moved the needle, you know, if I'm being honest, and maybe I've become jaded. So I'm open to that. You know, I think it's important for us to keep tugging and pulling at these ideas. And if you are going to do the human interest story, I'm just saying there's a way to not re-victimize people and not make them seem completely helpless. And not, I want to contest this idea of completely unaware of what's going on. Like we have hundreds of people showing up to get this combined sewer overflow meetings for the long-term control plan, right? That's to talk about the fact that our sewage system is like 100 years old. And we need to figure out if we're going to use gray infrastructure, where it should be placed. And, you know, no one believed me when I'm like, I'm going to bring out hundreds of people for this because they do care about flooding, even though they're so busy. You know, there wouldn't be a movement. And sometimes I feel like we're discredited, right? Like as organizers, like, oh, well, you know, it's I could make a lot more money working for like the private sector. People that do this work, it is because it's about our lifestyles and our accountability, our community, you know. So there are people who care about this and who are aware of it. Let's not just find the few people and say that there's a division in the community. I don't see a lot of division in my community when it comes to climate change. I actually even see more division when it comes to like police brutality, which is a hot button issue, but there are more range of perspectives there, you know, like there are a lot of issues, housing, a lot of range, but I don't see as much range, if I'm being honest, on climate change. It's more like sometimes the environmental stuff is like, that's for white people, but when we're talking about the harm in our communities, that's like pretty loud and clear where people stand, if I'm, you know, being honest with y'all, but I'm open to pushback.
Could I just clarify? I'm not suggesting stories divorced from all of the complications of climate change, but when you're covering really wonkish topics like climate, it's very scientific, or you have to do the homework that you were talking about earlier about going through the bills and all of that. Stories, just dry stories on that topic without a human, seeing where the humans connect. That's what I'm talking about. Not just doing a story about the impacts, but how to make this very dense topic human. I don't see how you can make it human without the humans, but I hear what you're saying, and I think that you make a lot of good points. Thank you.
Janelle, yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Answer your first question, similar to Maria, I don't see much division on climate or environmental degradation as an issue whole. However, there is often division when it comes to support of individual projects. And that is often stoked even further by the stories we tell about that. So for example, coastal GasLink pipeline, like I said, is the hot button issue in my community. My community on paper as their band council, so not their traditional governance structure, but as the government Indian Act structure, on paper is a supporter of the coastal GasLink pipeline and has signed a mutual benefit agreement. So you will find in Canada often there are Indigenous communities that support individual projects. Because the reality is Indigenous people have been excluded from the economic system. I would say my generation is the first generation that does more openly participate or can openly participate in the Western economic system. But of course, there's lots of barriers to access that, whether it's generational trauma, poverty, living in a rural community. But yeah, basically Indigenous communities are in crisis. In Canada, we have many Indigenous communities without clean drinking water, without adequate access to healthcare, living in crowded housing, and then of course experiencing climate emergencies. And because Indigenous communities under the Indian Act fall under federal jurisdiction, whereas climate emergency response is often provincial jurisdiction. There's sometimes a lot of finger pointing, and Indigenous communities actually don't get the help they need when they're experiencing crises like flood and forest fires. So there's division because Indigenous communities are basically having their poverty weaponized against them as a way for corporations to basically use them like bargaining chips in order to get sign off or Indigenous consent for their projects. And sometimes that story is told as in, yeah, there's communities that support and there's communities that are on the front lines fighting against it without any nuance as to why the communities would support a project, which has everything to do with the structural, very intentional design of Indigenous dispossession and poverty as a way to get access to resources. They are not, impoverished because it is by design that they are reliant on resources for money. And the only way out of that really is for the government to be paying reparations or to pay money out of the Indian Trust Fund, which has been collecting the royalties on the resources for the last century, and for that to be repaid for the communities so that communities can decide whether they want to support projects without having to do so out of necessity. And I think honestly, if that were to happen, there would be really very few communities that would still be willing to go along and to sign those deals and build those projects if they weren't doing so out of necessity for things like clean water or healthcare facilities that should of course be a right for all people living in this country. And then, yeah, I don't have much more to add on the second question. I think human stories can be done well when it's done in a trauma-informed way. And I think that often involves for journalists and storytellers to drop the angle that they've made up in their mind and really find out what individuals want to forefront and talk about, and to highlight the solutions and ways out of it, so that we're not just telling these trauma stories that are traumatizing for the person being interviewing, and also sometimes disparaging for the people reading it, and just causes them to feel more hopeless and that there's no solutions. It's really important that people see a way to contribute or to join a movement of people that care about the issues they care about.
All right, thanks, Janelle. So folks, we have 15 more minutes and 3 more questions. I think we can do this. This is my gentle reminder to shorten preambles and ask questions so that our speakers have more time to talk. And Osha, I won't be timing you, I promise. But go, you're next.
Okay, so I do have a question for both Janelle and Maria, and thank you so much for what you've already said. I was wondering, do you think that the framing of generational differences in climate change, that do you think that that's a reflection, that kind of framing by journalists is a reflection of white journalism that does have more of a generational maybe look at things and discounting different generations? Janelle, you had mentioned about elders, and my experience with Native peoples here in Arizona and across the country is there isn't the same kind of divide, cultural divide, and there's more respect for older people. But I just want to know how both you and Maria view this whole idea of this dichotomy of the enemy is maybe the older generation. Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. Yeah, don't like it. I think, again, I think the truths we know are the stories we tell, and the older generation was really, used as a machine to advance capitalism, to keep a racial wedge, to keep a class wedge, to really drive the idea that of neoliberalism and individualism, that if you work hard, you will reap the benefits. And yeah, I think there's some truth to the generational divide, but I think blaming our grandparents is really just a distraction to the real enemies, which are the corporate elite and the 1% and the billionaires and the government that enables them. So I think any enemy that is not that is a distraction. I think there's ways to tell that story with nuance, but yeah, to not allow the people at the top to distract us with ways we point the fingers at one another or at other countries or blah, 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 blah. It has everything to do with the corporate elite and the government that is constantly lobbied by them and beholden to them.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with all those points, and I appreciate the question and like the framing that it might come from a white gaze sort of thing, because I don't understand the generational stuff in reporting at all. I guess it's easy clickbait because there's personality spectrums in any generation, and I think it's become so microized, right? Like what is it? X is now the Z and millennials. Like I'm like, it's just kind of like a little bit too much, and it doesn't even make accounting sense, right? When you're categorizing people that are like 15 years apart and generalizing about them and their personality traits, I think that's just really unhelpful, and it presupposes. I think it's a different way of kicking the can down the road to say, well, when these people come into power, things will be different, but things won't be different unless we tell the story differently, So I would like to see that trend die off.
All right, thanks. I blame the boomers personally. No, just joking. Melissa, you have a question.
Yes, I would just like to find out. I mean, I've been listening to the conversation and getting all of the different views as it relates to angles, etc., and how journalism itself is practiced. And so, how do you think the cacophonous space of social media? Do you think that that fractures the stories that are being told as it relates to climate justice and environmental racism? Because in my space, while we have, and I work for a national newspaper, while we put the information out there, sometimes you compete directly with social media in terms of the types of stories that are told and how it is, of course, as mentioned before, framed. So how do you, as people out there doing the work, how do you see that, or how do you relate to that?
So yeah, I'm like, do you want to go first? It's well, harder to do online. At social media, I don't know. I don't know the role of social media. It's important and it's not. And I don't know. It's just part of the ecosystem. So I'm not really sure, if I'm being honest, what your question is. Like, uh, I have corporations that have like tried their spin on social media, but they're not as popular as we are somehow. You know, like I'm like, they have a lot more money, they have hired people, but they are not successful. I have seen good examples though. They can get their pieces actually more placed in the press. You know, like they have sponsored content in a lot of the newspaper. And so that's actually what we contend. And we try to use social media to like where we can't get necessarily in the publications space. Social media has been helpful for us to get our story, and I think that's where we are a little ahead of the corporations, you know. But I don't know how much of a difference it always makes, since the policymakers and the elected officials pick up the newspaper. They're not getting their info always from social media. I find that even elected officials, there's less examples of the ones that are social media educated, like that they're good at it, you know. And a lot of the ones, when we tag them, they don't even use their page, or their page is just a bunch of flyers, you know. So we're competing in a space where our audience is just different, and I think that that is a real unbalance, you know. So I don't know how that relates necessarily to journalists, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, social media is a whole beast that I don't really know the exact answer to, but I would say like places for really nuanced stories to be told are still in traditional media and important. And even when you see a debate happening under a social media post, like people are not citing other social media posts, like they're going back to the stories and the research that's done. So I think it's really important still. And yeah, keeping in mind that the younger generation that is probably far ahead, well, is more far ahead on understanding climate justice and its connection to racial justice and all the nuances in between, like are often filling the space generating their own media. And that the generations older are the generations that are voting, the generations that have spending power, the generations that exist in institutions that they can influence and power are still relying on traditional media. So yeah, I think it's like, social media is an important consideration, but it's not like the most important thing, and it's not like unimportant either. It's also kind of out of our control. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So our final question goes to Amy.
So this is incredibly helpful. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to try to keep it short. I'm in Orlando, Florida, and here in Central Florida, we've just come through this extraordinarily devastating hurricane season with hurricanes Ian and Nicole. And in Central Florida, we have widespread flooding. We have a very large community in Orlando and Central Florida from the Caribbean, And we also have a lot of low wage workers in the hospitality industry and in the theme parks and everything. So my question for you, I'm going to be I've been working on this for several weeks, and I'll be working on this, for many more months. And my question for you, as these communities face crises like this, what do you think is the biggest thing that is missing from the news coverage when it comes to crises like this? And what do you think is the most annoying thing that white journalists do in communicating with these communities? Bottom line is we're professional communicators, and can you help us, communicate with, these groups of people in a more effective way?
Yeah, I guess just a short answer is I think the most important thing is naming the villain. And like I'll say it again, it's the corporate elite, it's the billionaire 1%, and it's the government that enables them. And it's really important to name that, because I think people often think about climate change as like just a phenomena or like an inevitable symptom of human progress, and it's not. And we know that because there is cultures all over the world, pre-imperialism and colonialism, that existed on these lands for thousands of years and had really advanced technologies, advanced governance structures, and ways of taking care of the land and each other. And the more we make it about blaming ourselves or blaming one another, the more people feel hopeless and immobilized, rather than they're the villains are a few people with names and addresses. It's the government officials who know them and are enabling them. And by coming together, we can force their hand to give us the climate action we want and need. And no matter who you are, you can use your skill set, your influence to be a part of something greater. So I would say that's the most important thing. And what's annoying is when it's a very like harrowing story that's just victimizing the people over and over, and really kind of just showcasing the trauma and destruction without naming who did that and why, and being very clear that there is an alternative. There has been an alternative in the past. Basically the destruction that has happened has only happened within a couple generations and can be undone in a couple generations as well.
Yeah, definitely echo all of that. And for me, annoying things that happen is like that individual suggestions. Like, what can you do? What can you do? It's always like one person. And I see that shift of blame, right? Or like shift of responsibility to take action onto like the reader, to the audience, of like everyone by themselves. So like all of us can't just buy a tote bag and be done with it. Like, actually, we need to band together, and there has to be like collective action. And you will not save the world alone. Like, we don't live in the world of superheroes, And I think that media plays a role in trying to perpetuate, be your own superhero, but it's actually about build a connection, build a relationship with communities, and band together in order to change the system. And I think obviously like in Florida, we're seeing that a lot. Like, what's going to happen to people without flood insurance and hurricane insurance? They're just going to get, all these properties are going to get bought up, and there's going to be disaster capitalism. This is not natural disasters. We need to stop reporting on hurricanes and climate change events as if they're natural disasters. They're human disasters. Humans made this, created the conditions under which there would be such tragedy, under which people would not be able to be recover properly. There would be no just recovery, and there would be so much death. We decided to build up right where there should be natural buffer zones. Nature's going to do what we're pushing it to do, and it is us and our design that's actually causing the problems, right? And so we need to shift the focus, because it keeps happening. Like, hurricanes are just, oh my God, what a surprise. It's no longer a surprise. Let's stop acting surprised, and let's stop blaming the weather. Let's actually, we need to really focus and not make this individual, push people to connect with each other, tell them where the next meeting is, where they can find out something about it, what programs they should be paying attention to. I want to see public participation be more than just voting. Democracy is actually about knowing where decisions about you get made, and showing up and having a say, you know. And when people show up and see that their elected officials are doing a bad job, they actually probably vote. They will vote once they realize those people do a terrible job, you know. But we do need to engage communities to be more active, and that's not just vulnerable communities, it's all communities, you know, that need to take collective responsibility. We can't just keep putting it on the vulnerable to take these 5 tips to like protect themselves from the next hurricane, you know. So I understand that clickbait is a reality, but we need to avoid the traps and make something that's meaningful and leaves behind legacy. So I appreciate having been able to hang out with y'all for this time.
Hey, Maria and Janelle, thank you both so much for giving us some of your time today. This was perfect way to kick off our workshop, and we truly, truly appreciate it. Journalists, we do a IJNR round of applause. So we all golf clap in our little screens. So let's give our speakers their round of applause. We, again, truly appreciate this. You have unfortunately signed up to have your contact info be given to this group of reporters you're looking at. So I'm assuming some will follow up with questions. And for all our participants, you will be getting that list of speakers and their contact info after the workshop. So Janelle and Maria, you can go about your daily life.